Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Hello world, you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. North Korea has come a long way in its ballistic missile and nuclear weapons program. If we take its ballistic missile program, North Korea started buying Soviet Scud-Bs in 1976. 8 years later, it had already reverse-engineered its Scud-Bs and created its domestic variant, the Hwasong missile. These missiles were not particularly sophisticated, lacking range and accurate guidance, but they were of a technology simple enough for North Korea to manufacture in numbers. Soon, North Korean ballistic missiles posed a tactical threat that could no longer be ignored. Hair-trigger mobilization and short distance to target meant that had a war broken out between North and South Korea in the late 1980s, the first and second generation Hwasong missiles would have left their mark on South Korea. By the mid-1980s, the North Koreans developed the Nodong ballistic missile. With a range of 1,300 kilometers, this missile, derived from the Soviet Scud-C, effectively covered all of South Korea. Being road mobile, Nodong launchers could be redeployed after firing their payload, making detection and interception of this variant difficult. By the 2010s, the North Korean arsenal was strengthened by the Musudan ballistic missile. With a range of 2,500 to 4,000 kilometers, Pyongyang could theoretically target heavily populated parts of Japan, including Tokyo, and the American North Pacific island outpost of Guam. Then, in 2017, North Korea tested its first intercontinental ballistic missile, its range being enough to hit the west coast of the United States, sending alarm bells ringing around the world. While it is still believed that North Korea cannot mate a nuclear weapon to its growing fleet of short, medium, and intercontinental range missiles, if left to develop this technology unmolested, the good money is that Pyongyang should manage this technical feat in the near term. Since assuming office, President Donald Trump has mercilessly sledged North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, almost oblivious to the dangers associated with doing so. Name-calling and counter-name-calling has sent temperatures rising on the Korean Peninsula, arguably the most dangerous place on Earth because of the degree of national militarization on both sides of the 38th parallel, the dividing line between North and South Korea. But just as quickly as tensions arose between the Trump White House and Pyongyang, they were put on ice. Now the world holds its breath in anticipation for the first meeting between a US and North Korean leader. A summit has been called by Trump and has been agreed to by Kim, tentatively scheduled for sometime in May. North Korea seems to have what it's always wanted, to be treated as a regional power. South Korean leader Moon Jae-in was first to blink, leading the charge to de-escalate tensions with his northern neighbor. Xi Jinping of China has recently met with Kim. The discussions, while secret, would no doubt have briefed Kim on what China would find acceptable with any North Korean-American dialogue. Should the US-North Korean summit go ahead, Japan will have to also reach out to North Korea and treat it like a normalized international player. Today we are happy to have with us internationally renowned Japan scholar from the University of Adelaide, Professor Purnendra Jain. Professor Jain is also a member of the SIA Advisory Board. We are also joined with SIA's resident existentialist philosopher, David Olney. Before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that Strategicon can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, YouTube, and of course on the Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. Hi Purnendra, welcome back to Strategicon. It's been a while.
Thank you, John. Good to be back. to your podcast.
Purnendra, if I could start off with my first question, and that is, how does Japan see the threat posed by North Korea? Does Tokyo trust the various bilateral initiatives to de-escalate tensions on the Korean Peninsula, such as South Korean President Moon's use of softer language leading up to and during the Winter Olympics, or Xi Jinping's recent meeting with Kim?
Okay, certainly for Japan, North Korea is a question of existential threat. And this is nothing new. I mean, there is a long history behind it since the kind of end of World War II or maybe 1940, when the Korean Peninsula was divided into two. And since then, especially since the end of the Korean War, Japan and North Korea have had very difficult relationships. And in more recent years, North Korea has become a country of a strategic concern as well as a kind of serious threat to its territory and to its people and to the nation as a whole. Now, the question about whether Tokyo trusts the various bilateral initiatives, as far as I can see, Tokyo is interested in moving forward to a position where North Korea can be brought to a negotiating table and some resolution which is in favor of Japan is which comes forward. Now, the meeting with the South Korean president, which will happen, actually, I think, end of this month, with the North Korean leader, that is something which, Tokyo is carefully watching and monitoring what's going to happen. In terms of the meeting with Xi Jinping late last month in March, this was quite an interesting piece of work because no one expected that something like that was coming. It was kind of an unexpected move on the part of the North Korean leader, as I understand. And why he did that, that's a question we can talk about. But the point is that the ground was made with North Korea accepting to join the Winter Olympics in South Korea. And that was a kind of a time when North Korea began to give some indications that it was willing to have some kind of a meeting or some kind of negotiation with South Korea. And then that was a time, or just a month before that, we may remember what kind of language Mr. Trump was using for Mr. Kim, and what Mr. Kim said, kind of rocket man and dotard kind of exchange of words. No one thought that, in February, March, these two leaders will start talking about a summit meeting.
Purnendra, is there an uncomfortable dualism in the way that Japan has to communicate with South Korea and China, in that they need to talk to anyone they can about moving forward with a potential North Korean threat, but at the same time there's a constant internal dialogue in Japan about the need to perhaps remilitarize? So anytime they're talking to the South Koreans and the Chinese, are they sending the South Koreans and Chinese mixed messages, where on one hand they want negotiation, but on the other they have to prepare for military action?
Yeah, that's a good question. We know the relationship between Japan and China on one hand, and Japan and South Korea on the other hand. Japan and China have had a very vexed relationship, and in more recent years, or perhaps weeks and months, the relationships have gone from bad to worse. So it is very difficult for Japan to talk with China in terms of North Korea, or whether the Chinese leadership is willing to talk to Japan. We don't know about that. With South Korea, one would think that it might be easier because South Korea is an ally of the US, as Japan is. So this hub and spoke system, in the case of US, South Korea, Japan, has not worked quite well as in many other hub and spokes kinds of system, for example, Australia, Japan, US. Even though both Japan and South Korea, they are allies of the US, the Japan-South Korea relationship has been very, very difficult. And it has been difficult because of history, and history in particular of Japan's colonization of the Korean Peninsula, and of course non-resolution of some of the issues like the textbook issue, and even more so, the comfort women issue. So the history comes to haunt the Japan-South Korea relationship. Having said all these things, Japan does not just have to negotiate China and South Korea, but it has also to negotiate the United States, because necessarily the US or Washington and Tokyo, they don't have similar views on North Korea because their interests are different. From Japan's perspective, they want a resolution about the abductees because Tokyo has made it a big issue, and this is quite a domestic issue for Japan, and it's not going to let it go. But from the Washington's perspective, the abduction issue may not be that important. For them, what is important is to denuclearize North Korea. Of course, Japan is interested in that, but necessarily my point is that Washington and Tokyo, they don't have similar views. And it is not for nothing that Japan's Prime Minister, early in the 2000s, 2002, 2004, Mr. Koizumi went twice to North Korea to negotiate directly, and it gives us the signal that maybe Tokyo does not trust Washington in this particular context.
That's very interesting that it comes down to sort of this hub and spoke model, and that really, Tokyo and Washington are on different spokes. Is there any potential, do you think, for Australia to play any kind of useful hub role in that, America has made it clear they want Japan and Australia to work together more closely on security issues? Could we potentially provide a hub between the South Koreans and the Japanese, and maybe the Japanese and the Americans, to be that sort of in-between voice where we increase our relevance but also, mitigate the apparent disagreements between, the US and Japan over North Korea?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how Australia would play a mediating role as a spoke of the United States security system. What we surely know that US, Japan and Australia, on most strategic and security issues, they are on the same page, more or less. But being on the same page does not mean that Australia can have some influence on the issue or issues related to North Korea-Japan question. Because we have seen in the past, if you look at the six-party talks, for example, certainly Australia was not a part of that process. And Australia has not been an important actor, a strategic actor in Northeast Asia. So I don't know, actually I would like to hear from you, in fact, whether you think that Australia can play some kind of a role there. I don't understand and I don't know what role can Australia play, except that Australia will support Japan's case for abductees, and Australia will be in support of Japan in terms of having a resolution which does not go against the interests of Japan.
My feeling is that we can probably work at low-level socialisation between security forces. The fact that we've now got a bigger training area in Queensland where the Singaporeans are going to come and train, we can do lots of things at a very practical level of interoperability, but I don't personally feel it could go to a higher diplomatic level. I just hope maybe you had a better answer than me.
No, I mean, I totally agree with you in terms of if we go that path where a war breaks out, then maybe Australia will have a role to play there. But on diplomatic issues directly, I don't know, and I haven't seen any commentary on that where Australia can play a real role so as to impact or to make some directional changes as far as the negotiation goes ahead. So I'm not sure about that.
So once again, we end up just being the deputy sheriff who's good once the gunfight's on, but no use to stop the gunfight happening.
Well, it's not, I think I won't go that far. My point is that, look, Australia is far removed from that particular strategic environment. And the parties which are affected or which are central to this issue are those 6 countries: North Korea, South Korea, Japan, Russia, China, and the United States. And I do not see a role for Australia directly. It has nothing to do with being Dept or not being Dept.
Purnendra, basically it comes down to size, doesn't it? I mean, our size and it actually affects our impact on whether or not we can inject ourselves into this. I mean, the large powers, you're talking about powers of international consequence. Australia may be a liminal power in Asia, it may be a middle power in Asia, but it doesn't certainly have the kind of impact necessary to inject itself into this kind of stoush, yeah?
Yeah, right, yes.
Purnendra, just a couple of things. Firstly, you made mention about the fact that South Korea has a problem with Japan in terms of its history, but obviously so does North Korea because, when the Japanese colonized Korea, it colonized the entire peninsula, it didn't colonize just South Korea. Can you say anything about how Pyongyang views Tokyo and Japan and any potential diplomatic outreach that may come from the government of Shinzo Abe?
I mean, one aspect of North Korea-Japan relationship is that North Korea looks at Japan as an ally of the United States, right? So the view from Pyongyang, I think, would be that Japan is a close ally of the United States. It hosts close to 50,000 U.S. troops on its soil, and they can be used against North Korea, right? So in that way, strategically, Japan becomes kind of an adversary of North Korea. The other equation is the history issue, which you talked about, is, of course, the peninsula was a united Korea before the end of World War II. And when it was divided, and after the Korean War, we know that there was no peace treaty which was signed by North Korea and other parties, including Japan. With South Korea, Japan signed a peace treaty in the 1960s. With North Korea, that has not happened. But in the early years, for example, in the 1960s, 70s, Japan was still doing a lot of trade with North Korea, despite the fact that they did not recognize, there was no diplomatic recognition of North Korea, and yet they were doing lots of trade and they were helping North Korea. So when there is a process, I mean, in his meetings, when Mr. Koizumi went to Pyongyang, when he met with the father of the current leader, which is Kim Jong-il, at that time there was a speculation that Japan will offer a sizable amount of money to North Korea if they sign a peace treaty. So I think there will be a lot of pressure on Japan, which we will see if the negotiation between Pyongyang and Washington goes ahead. There is a lot of pressure on Japan to put money and give to North Korea as part of compensation or reparations. So I would think Japan will have to pay between 5 and 8 billion US dollars to North Korea. So yes, history issues are there, and one of those issues will be reparations. But then the other issues of abduction, the other issues of maybe comfort women, all these things will raise their heads as well at that time.
Purnendra, do you think that the Trump-Kim summit, if it goes ahead, will net some sort of peace dividend? And how will this affect Japan's security?
It's a very, very complex issue. First of all, my thoughts are that a very first meeting, if it happens, it will be a kind of knowing each other and talking to each other, kind of clearing the ground for further talks and further negotiations. I do not expect that there will be a big bang agreement and where Mr. Kim says, okay, we are denuclearizing, and US says we are recognizing you and forces its allies, South Korea and Japan, to do the same thing. Maybe if it happens, well and good, but I don't think that's going to happen. So I think Japan is in a very, very difficult situation. And that's why I think Prime Minister Abe is going to meet with Mr. Trump before Mr. Trump meets with Mr. Kim. So I think in that meeting, Mr. Abe will make it clear to the president as to what are Tokyo's perspectives and what Tokyo would like to come out of it. And he would also, of course, very carefully listen to what Mr. Trump has in mind. So it is very difficult whether there will be a peace dividend which will come out from this. I think that's a long way off because we are talking about such a complex situation in Northeast Asia. You have got China, you have got, of course, the two Koreas, Japan, Russia, and of course the US. If you look at the example of East and West Germany, for example, we may remember that it didn't happen in one go. It had several stages, and the Berlin Wall did not, was not crumble quickly. It took maybe 2 decades for that thing to happen. But I would guess there will be a lot more time needed, so we have to wait and see what happens with Kim-Moon summit, then Abe and Trump's meeting, following which there will be and there is likely to be a Trump-Kim summit. So we have to wait and see. Actually, it's very hard for me to think what will be the... Let's hope that something comes out of it. And then we progress from there, rather than we go backwards, because going backwards is the worst possible scenario, right? That might lead to war. And no one wants that. China doesn't want that. Japan doesn't want. Maybe, I don't know, Trump may go for that. But I'm sure from Tokyo's perspective and from Seoul's perspective, they don't want war. They don't want war on the Korean Peninsula, because that's going to affect them very, very badly. But they certainly also want North Korea to pull back what they are doing and what they have been doing in the since Kim Jong-un came in power. I mean, we're talking about 2 nuclear tests and how many missiles were launched and even reached Japan, and now he's talking about Washington under his nuclear attack. All those kinds of things have made the situation in Northeast Asia very, very dangerous.
You mentioned China then, Purnendra, and it got me thinking that for all the things that we can't hypothesize what happens next, the thing that popped into my head is the growing level of interconnectedness between the Japanese and Chinese economy. So much Japanese manufacturing has been outsourced to China. China is relying to a large degree on Japanese technology to up the quality of its production. So realistically, there's an economic link there between China and Japan that provides sort of a point of connectedness and stability where two countries that have a massive impact on North Korea have kind of found a way to work reasonably amicably together on quiet economic projects. If we can't sort of hypothesize on what might happen at all these meetings, do you think there's anything we can draw from growing in economic interconnectedness between Japan and China being able to provide some sort of softer economic landing for North Korea?
I mean, we know that China is already providing soft economic landing for North Korea. My sources tell me that since the Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un meeting, now there are train after train going from Beijing into Pyongyang, carrying lots of stuff for North Korea. So already China, Beijing is providing that kind of economic assistance, if you like, to Beijing, to North Korea. In terms of Japan, it is very difficult for Japan, domestically and internationally, having reached this situation that Japan is going to provide economic assistance to North Korea before they start dismantling some of their, defense program. So it will be very, very difficult. And you are absolutely right. China and Japan, there's interdependency. And we have this classic neoliberal explanation about how, economic interconnectedness is hardly likely to lead to war. That is one way of looking at it, that China and Japan, they would not like war and they would like to continue with their economic relationship. At the same time, we know that in terms of defense, in terms of the strategic orientations, they differ so much that it is highly unlikely that Japan and China will be on the same page with regards to helping and assisting North Korea in the near future. It might happen if the negotiation goes ahead. So Japan will do on its own rather than using Beijing as a mediator via media. So Japan would like to deal with North Korea bilaterally rather than via Beijing.
So it might be a case in the long run, perhaps, that Japan could provide money to North Korea and the North Koreans could spend that money to buy stuff from China, thus improving conditions in North Korea, keeping everyone involved, but very much in a hub-and-spoke model where Japan and China aren't seen to have compromised on core political beliefs.
Yeah, it is possible. I mean, once Japan starts giving money as part of its compensation, I don't think Japan will have conditions that whatever money you get from us, you must buy from us. In the past, Japan did that because immediately after the war in 1955, when Japan started giving compensation reparations to Southeast Asian countries in particular, then the reparation money was tied to Japanese technology and to Japanese goods and services. But in the 21st century, second decade of the 21st century, I don't think Japan is going to put those kind of restrictions. I don't think so. Who knows? And North Korea will be free to use that money, whether they want to buy from China or from Japan or wherever, or they just want to bank that money for future uses. But the linkage will be certainly there. Some kind of linkage will be there. And this linkage we can recognize, but necessarily these 3-4 countries together, they will not kind of cooperate as such, creating those kinds of linkages. So linkages might be created organic or in an organic fashion rather than in a creative fashion.
So it really needs to be multiple bilateralisms, one at a time, where they ended up with a raft of agreements, but each agreement is between 2 countries separate to everyone else and done privately.
Well, that's another thing we don't know, because when Japan was defeated, they had the San Francisco Peace Treaty. So Japan, one country, and all the allied powers were there. So Japan signed a peace agreement which satisfied most countries. Of course, China was not part of that. India was not that part of that. So whether a North Korean peace treaty will be with all nations or whether it will be bilateral, we don't know. I don't think the conversation has gone that far. So we have to, we have to wait and see in which direction this conversation goes. But the first thing first is what North Korea brings on the table and whether the kinds of items which North Korea brings on the table are acceptable to Washington first, and whether they are acceptable to South Korea and China and Japan.
We can't forget the North Koreans as well. I mean, they have a stake in this and they're not going to be passive bystanders. We've seen a brutal dictator attempt to win the West's favour before by disarming. I mean, we just have to remember Libyan Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, who gave away his ballistic missile and WMD programs only to find his end by being sodomized to death by Libyan rebels. Surely Kim knows that giving away the very assets that keep him and his family in power is loaded with risk. What do you think would satisfy Kim's idea on Korean security? I mean, is it just about getting, a proper ceasefire in place or a treaty in place?
I think he would like to get recognition of North Korea as a legitimate regime, not part of the evil or axis of evil as Bush has characterized North Korea. So that's one thing he would like to be recognized as a legitimate regime. The second thing he would like some kind of assurance and security that North Korea is not or will not remain a target of attack, whether rhetoric or in official documents. So these two things are very clear to me. But whether North Korea, in turn, or quid pro quo, whether North Korea is going to surrender or denuclearize, I am not sure on that. Because, as John, you have mentioned about the examples from other nations, I don't think North Korea would completely disarm itself and become naked. They will not take that approach. They might say they are going to halt it, and they will not do any further testing. They will not launch any further missile. But I don't think they are going to say, look, here are all our arsenals, take them away, and let's have this peace. I don't think that's going to happen in my view. So these things have to happen in a very gradual and in a very evolutionary process, because there is so much distrust which have been built between North Korea on the one hand and other countries, including the United States, on the other. We know what happened with the framework agreement talk. We know what Bill Clinton, when he went to North Korea, what he did, or when even back, Jimmy Carter. So North Koreans are not sure whether Americans are really serious bunch of people, or they're still trying to do something where they're trying to weaken North Korea. So North Korea is not going to expose itself to the world community as a weak nation. It will try and negotiate from a position of strength rather than from a position of weakness.
And now we'll have our musical interlude. You're listening to Strategicon, the podcast of SIA.
오빤 강남스타일 강남스타일 낮에는 따사로운 인간적인 여자 커피 한 잔에 여유를 아는 품격 있는 여자 밤이 오면 심장이 뜨거워지는 여자 그런 반전 있는 여자 너는 선호해 낮에는 너만큼 따사로운 그런 선호해 커피 식기도 전에 원샷 때리는 선호해 밤이 오면 심장이 터져버리는 선호해 그런 선호해 아름다워 사랑스러워 그래 너 그래 바로 너 아름다워 사랑스러워 그래 너 그래 바로 너 지금부터 갈 때까지 가볼까 오빤 강남스타일 강남스타일 오빤 강남스타일 강남스타일 오빤 강남스타일 Hey sexy lady 오빤 강남스타일 Hey sexy lady
That was the 2012 hit Gangnam Style by South Korean pop sensation Psy. Now let's return to our Northeast Asia Security Special featuring our special guest, Professor Purnendra Jain.
Purnendra, what are your thoughts on Chinese Premier Xi's stance on North Korea? We've heard time and again about Chinese annoyance with North Korea, that the relationship is less cooperative and pricklier than ever. But North Korea and its stability are vital for China's security. A united Korea would pose commercial as well as strategic challenges to China, potentially extending American strategic power to the North Korean-Chinese border along the Yalu River line. That being the case, are the Chinese truly annoyed with North Korea, or is this part of a strategic game designed to misinform the US and Japan on the actual strength of covert Chinese-North Korean cooperation and coordination?
Okay, big question and long one as well, John.
Sorry about that.
China-North Korea is quite an interesting relationship. In recent years, I think China feels at times it seems that China has been kind of in an embarrassing situation from North Korea. We have seen some examples where North Koreans tested missiles when China was hosting some international conferences, including, I think it was, can't remember, it was G20 or BRICS summit. So when they were hosting these regional or international meetings, the North Koreans chose that timing to launch their missiles. So what kind of message they were trying to send? They were trying to send this message to Beijing saying that you have also become one of them, right? And one of them means you are working with the United States and US allies, and you are trying to kind of advance your national interests and not behaving as a good friend of North Korea. So in that context, the Chinese leadership might have felt a little bit embarrassing situation. But the point we cannot forget and we should not overlook is, of course, North Korea is so important for China as a strategic point, and for China to maintain its influence and China to maintain its leverage over Japan, over US, and over South Korea. So this is such an important regime for China, and that's why China would like to be involved throughout in any negotiation which takes place between North Korea and other countries, including the United States. So let's not discount China. There might have been some moments in Beijing where they might have felt that, how to deal with this person. But on a long-term basis, history tells us, past examples tell us that North Korea is such an important piece of leverage for Beijing to pull its own or to influence not just the region, but also beyond this region.
Apart from a sort of Finlandized solution for North Korea, is there a time that you think that the idea of unifying the Koreas would not necessarily be a strategic threat to China?
It won't. So we are talking about a prospect of a unified Korea.
Yeah.
If that happens, that's going to change the entire strategic equation of Northeast Asia and the entire world, as a matter of fact, right? So if that happens, a united Korea may be good for the United States because they don't have to deal with the kinds of situations which they have been dealing with for the last 50 years. That might come to an end, but certainly then the United Korea will become an important player. And from Japan's perspective, that might be a good idea, But from China's perspective, this may not be a good idea because, as I said before, because North Korea gives a strength to China. North Korea is a source of strength for China, a source of negotiation, is a source of, embarrassing other countries. So if North Korea disappears and there is unification, it's good for the world. It may not be so good for China. But I don't know whether that is going to happen or not. We are still thinking like 5 years ahead of our time.
See, that's very interesting, the idea of what would mean for a unified Korea, because I can't help going back to what we were talking about with interdependence, that if we have economic interdependence between Japan and China, and we have strategic interdependence between North Korea and China, the one certainty is here that South Korea is a potential economic competitor to both Japan and China, and is a strategic problem, in a sense, for both countries. So, in some strange way, the status quo of North and South Korea remaining separate, but North Korea becoming stable and reliable, having sensible command and control over its limited nuclear arsenal, providing that strategic gap between, the West and China, not upsetting the apple cart economically, that really the idea of it unifying would just destabilise everything even more. So it seems to me that anyone who's talking about unification at this point is in some sort of idealistic place, when in reality what would benefit most people most is simply to stabilise the nuclear arsenal under good command and control, a stable regime, to trickle wealth in from China, to trickle money in from Japan, and to tell the South Koreans to just please be calm.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's the best scenario. But let's not forget, South Korea has pursued a policy of what they call sunshine policy. And this sunshine policy, the current president of South Korea is very much, Mr. Moon, is very much in favor of this sunshine policy. And part of this sunshine policy, in my view, includes the idea of a unified Korea. Although, of course, they have not talked about this, but I think the underlying text is that a unified Korea will be the best outcome from South Korea's perspective. But as David, you have talked about, and as I said, that it will create lots of other issues and lots of other problems along the way. So, at the moment, what you are suggesting is better to have North Korea as an independent, a separate entity with command and control system, maybe a peace treaty, help from the neighboring states, including Japan and South Korea and China, to North Korea to become a stable and dependable regime, not creating strategic difficulties for other countries and other partners in the region and beyond. I think this is that will be the best outcome in the short to medium term, but in the long term, who knows which way China is going to turn, what happens in 5 to 10 years' time in China, whether Xi Jinping is going to continue, there will be a revolution, there will be a kind of internal rebellion against the Chinese regime. We don't know these things. So we are living in a world of so much uncertainties, but we can still create some scenarios. And that scenario, in my view, kind of short and medium, is North Korea will stay as an independent entity, not kind of a unified South Korea in the next 3 to 10 years. That's my take. I may be completely wrong.
Hey, at least we'll be wrong together.
Place your bets, everyone. Place your bets. Purnendra, so far, Japan has kept a reasonably cool head regarding security threats from China and North Korea. I mean, it has bolstered its defences, but not in an overtly aggressive manner. Prime Minister Abe is a Japanese nationalist, and his constituents want a stronger Japan and a stronger Japanese military. How have Chinese and North Korean military threats and provocations impacted on Japanese pacifism?
Well, I think North Korea is one of the factors when we look at Japan's defense policy. And for the first time in 2013, just 5 years ago, Japan issued a national strategic framework It never had written that kind of document as we have seen in the case of the United States and Britain, for example. And one of the reasons is, of course, this anxiety of North Korea. The other thing which we have seen, although, of course, Japan has not changed its constitution, so the pacifist clause of the constitution remains intact. But there have been incremental changes in Japan's defense policy. And, for example, Japan has lifted ban on export of armaments, for example. Japan has also now is able to participate in what they call joint, I just can't get the term, but they can now participate with the US and other allies in keeping peace and in joining in third countries. And also Japan has increased its defense capabilities. Last year, actually, Japan has increased its defense budget after many years of kind of maintaining the defense budget at a certain level. And in terms of acquisition, now Japan is trying and will try to acquire more defense equipment to deal with the North Korean threat in particular. They may not yet go to nuclear option because we know that the US umbrella is still there. But, the point is, as perhaps you would agree, John and David, that so far Japan was quite happy with the US commitment of protecting Japan. But in the last several years, Japan is a little bit nervous and not sure to what extent the US is going to protect Japan in case there was a missile attack. So Japan is trying to improve its capability. And we can talk about some nitty-gritty details, but we don't need to go into that. But certainly Japan might be looking at purchasing cruise missiles, for example. I don't know, but there has been talk along that line. Whether the U.S. ironclad security assurance stands intact, I think from Japan's perspective, my discussion with some of my colleagues in Japan, they are not very sure about it. So it's going to be and there will be pressure on Japan from the U.S. as well to spend more money to do something more, those kinds of issues. I think we can talk about U.S. troops and how much Japan spends on U.S. troops stationed in Japan.
I'm just wondering whether the arrival of Donald Trump has really signaled a slide in the relationship between Tokyo and Washington. Because, if the Japanese are after security guarantees, and for at least over a generation they received from the US as best a guarantee as they possibly can from across the Pacific, now all of a sudden we're dealing with a person who has played very hard and fast, and some would say even loose, with regard to overseas basing and what the Americans believe is their right to bring back from allies in terms of cost, recovery of overseas basing and military protection. How do you see the arrival of Donald Trump having altered the cornerstone of Northeast Asian security, especially the relationship between Japan and the United States?
It seems to me, of course, like the coming of Trump was a surprise to Tokyo, as it was a surprise to many capital cities around the world and to many analysts and to many commentators. Actually, in Tokyo, Prime Minister Abe and others, when they traveled to Washington, they didn't think, even during the campaign, they didn't think that Trump had a chance. But when he became president, Mr. Abe was the first one, actually, to go to Washington and meet with Mr. Trump. So he sent a very early signal that Tokyo is willing to engage with Mr. Trump. No matter what he was saying about his allies in terms of expenses of U.S. foreign bases and so on and so forth, so forth. Abe gave this signal to Mr. Trump very, very clearly that we will work through and our alliance is intact and Tokyo is willing to work with Washington and work with the new administration. So I do not see there is much difference of opinion between the current U.S. administration and the current administration in Tokyo. They want to work together. At the same time, of course, Tokyo is very nervous because they don't know which way Mr. Trump is going to turn, because he changes his mind so quickly, and things are so uncertain. So Japan is not sure, like Australia, Japan is not sure where Mr. Trump, which way is he going to turn when he meets with Mr. Kim. Will he keep in mind Tokyo's interests? So I think Mr. Abe is going to remind and reinforce his view of North Korea and what he wants from North Korea. And that's why he's going to meet with Mr. Trump. I think there is only one agenda for Mr. Abe's visit to Washington is to talk about the possible Trump-Kim summit.
My reading of this, Purnendra, I'm sort of interested in your opinion, is I sort of view the Japanese Prime Minister going to Washington so quick is a recognition that no one can provide the security umbrella for Japan that they once had. The security umbrella was created in an era where North Korea couldn't use nuclear weapons. Japan wasn't indirect threat. Now it's indirect threat. To me, it seems it's a new game for Japan, and the new game is not what direct level of security the US can provide, but what level of security technology Japan can buy, modify, improve from the Americans to get a better outcome for itself. So really, I wonder if it's more an issue of Prime Minister Abe was there early because he needs to get a good deal on buying stuff. And the one thing that we could argue that Trump keeps saying he's interested in, and the only thing he seems to show any consistency in, is deals. Sell something, make money. So is this essentially, we saw the change in Japanese defence spending, we saw the change in Japanese defence documentation about where they perceive they're going. Was the trip to America really a take the shopping list and see what we can buy trip?
At the moment, my reading of it, you might be right to a certain extent. But at the moment, I think Japan is not prepared. Legally, constitutionally, and in terms of its popular opinion in Japan. So Mr. Abe has to play this very carefully, and he has to secure from US or from the president that what his advisors have talked about, what they call ironclad security assurance. So that assurance, of course, Mr. Abe wants from President Trump. And I don't think Mr. Trump will say, no, we cannot guarantee you. It's not that he's not going to say that. But at the same time, because Mr. Trump is also interested in doing deals, as you have said, as David has said, it is very important from Trump's perspective that perhaps Japan spends more money on defense equipment and buy more from Japan. So I won't totally discount the argument which David has made about a shopping list. But this shopping list may not be that big. It might be just small, and he will keep in his back pocket and not kind of reveal in front of Mr. Trump. If Mr. Trump kind of insists on that issue, then he might say something. But I don't think he's going with a list of shopping list where he will say, Mr. Trump, this is what we want to buy. I don't think that's going to happen because Mr. Abe knows there is not enough domestic constituency for this kind of deal with Washington in Japan. So Mr. Abe has to first prepare the ground in Japan itself.
The Japanese domestic issues are still just far too big. Yep.
Yes, and because still people oppose in Japan about constitutional amendment. People still oppose Japan to restart some of the nuclear power plants. because they are so nuclear averse and opposed to anything which has got nuclear attached to it. They will not allow, under the current circumstances, Mr. Abe to go a full-fledged shopping list and buy lots of arms from the US, or even to think in terms of, beginning to think in terms of having a nuclear program in Japan. So these things may come. I am not ruling out their possibilities. These things may come. If this forthcoming meeting fails and there becomes a real possibility of war, then Japan will have no option but to convince and persuade its people that, look, we have had enough. We need to secure ourselves. We need to secure our people and security of our nation. And this is what we need to do. So I think this is like third or fourth step. I would still hold my breath a little bit for a better outcome in the next 12 months.
Purnendra, American anti-ballistic missile technology, specifically the Patriot PAC-2s, have come under some criticism recently owing to their poor performance during the Saudi-Houthi war. Considering that South Korean and Japanese air defences have the American Patriot system as their primary anti-ballistic missile anti-aircraft system, how confident are Seoul and Tokyo sheltering under this US-manufactured umbrella in the face of the Patriots' less than stellar performance in protecting the Saudi capital, Riyadh?
It's quite interesting. First of all, I don't know. The Japanese have, and the Japanese self-defense forces, they have never been in a combat situation, right? So, and they have to trust some of these anti-ballistic, whether they are medium or long, what the Americans offer them, right? And things can go wrong. And we have seen in the case of Japan, although, what's the name of this aircraft where they had accidents in other countries and also in Japan, but they're still going ahead with that aircraft. What is it called?
Ospreys.
Osprey?
Yeah, Ospreys, that's right.
Yeah.
So I think I think it's a similar situation where Japan does not have any option but to depend on what the US is telling them and accept that. But as I said previously, a little while ago, that Japan might go for cruise missiles and purchase from the US. If they think that that's not enough, let's have this. But that will happen only if the negotiation fails. And, the Japanese feel threatened even more. Then I think Japan will have different kinds of options. And I'm sure the Japanese strategists and defense planners, they are thinking along these lines. But there is nothing in the public space at the moment on those issues.
Purnendra, just on the new US National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, John Bolton, what are your bets moving forward with regard to a potential bloody nose attack against North Korea now that John Bolton is Trump's National Security Advisor and also an old neocon? Do you think that a bloody nose attack, were it to eventuate, could be contained as a limited strike against North Korea? Or do you think that, with such a scenario, an uncontrolled response is the likely outcome?
I think, maybe from the US perspective, they might think that way. But my take on this is that neither Tokyo, nor Seoul, nor Beijing would buy that kind of attack from the United States, because that's going to unsettle the entire Northeast Asian region. And China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, they don't want this kind of situation. So they will try and persuade the US not to go for that option, right? But if that happens, then this will have severe repercussions on the Northeast Asian strategic environment, There will be refugees from North Korea going into China, into South Korea, into Japan. It will be a chaotic, it's a mayhem. And I don't think none of these nations in the region would like to see this kind of situation. And I only hope that doesn't happen. And hopefully, John Bolton, being in the actual power situation, he will understand the repercussions. It's one thing to be a conservative and nationalist and, making statements when you don't have a powerful position. But when you come in that position, there are lots of things you need to consider and weigh and think before you make. So it has to be some kind of calculated and rational decision, not kind of because Mr. Bolton wants it, let's do it. It's not going to happen that way, John. That's my reading of it.
And I agree with Purnendra. My great hope is that nothing that dumb happens. I can't remember if it was 2016 or 2017 when the big American South Korean exercises were on, and the media were providing coverage that huge quantities of SEAL Team 6 were in South Korea practicing a decapitation operation. And you go, you really, really, really hope that isn't true. And if it is true, whose demented idea was that? Because that is just one level of provocation too far. And hopefully the bad press that got at the time will be seen. There's too much here to lose when there's a chance of gains.
So, Purnendra, just finally from me, the Obama era's pivot to Asia was a total fizzer. Indeed, Obama-era diplomacy and strategy, while seemingly rational in comparison to what we're experiencing under Trump, was lackluster and indecisive. Obama talked a good talk, but misunderstood American priorities, which were and continue to be the stability of the Middle East. Trump has avoided sweeping grand strategic statements in favour of his art of the deal, keep 'em guessing style. Do you think that in spite of the international criticism levelled at him, Trump's strategic unpredictability can net Northeast Asia unexpected security gains?
I would hope so. Trump has not, as you say, there is no grand strategy or narrative of what he wants to achieve. There is no pivot to Asia, for example, or rebalancing kind of thing which gave a signal as to what the Obama administration stood for. Whether he achieved anything or not, that's another issue to consider. And you are right in the sense that, under the Obama two administrations, things got out of hand. And not just North Korea. If you look at some of the nuclear tests which happened when Obama was president, and lots of missile tests. Also, China's expansion into the South China Sea, for example, and its influence in the Indian Ocean and so on and so forth. These things were achieved by North Korea and China, while Obama was trying to talk to people that he's bringing his attention back to the Asia Pacific, but nothing much happened except we are seeing more and more difficult strategic situations in the region, and that actually this has made countries like Japan in a very difficult situation. Every time Japan is pushed on the back foot, and then Japan has to respond to those kinds of things. But at least in the case of Mr. Trump, people are not expecting anything. It's so uncertain, right? So uncertainty, in a sense, becomes a strength for other countries to think very carefully. They don't need to depend on pivot to Asia or rebalancing, and nothing happens. So in a sense, Trump has given a good opportunity, in my view, for others to sit up and think for themselves, right? And make some strategies and make some scenarios as to what would happen, rather than sit back and relax that the US is there to protect us because Obama is saying this or President is saying this. So the world has changed. Let's accept this. And the world has changed partly because of the new president in the Oval Office. So let's take cognizance of that, this change, this uncertainty. You can't trust other countries. You can't trust what they're saying. So in a sense, the world is not the same as it was before Trump came into the Oval Office. The world has changed dramatically, and everyone has to think very, very carefully. They have to keep their thinking caps on all the time. No time to sit back and relax.
Thank you very much for that. David, do you have any final questions for Purnendra?
No, just to totally and utterly agree that a slightly entropic America is everyone's friend.
And that's a very positive way to end this podcast. Purnendra, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today.
Thanks very much, John and David. Good to talk to you.
Thank you, Purnendra.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategicon through iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn and YouTube. And please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, goodbye.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.